On a cool October morning in Wilkesboro, North Carolina in 1982, 20-year-old Angela Hamby was getting ready for a fun adventure. Alongside her mother, Angela planned to take a shopping trip out of town where they'd spend the day checking out clothes, eating in nice restaurants, and having a good time. Before she could go, though, Angela had a few errands to run. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the 20-year-old left the family home with plans to be back inside of an hour. She never made it back, though, and as time continued to pass, her mother grew more and more worried. By mid-afternoon, she'd contacted the police, who began searching for the missing woman, but there didn't appear to be any trace of her. 15 long hours after her disappearance, investigators stumbled upon her car. It had been abandoned behind a local hotspot, Glenn's Tasty Freeze. Inside, they found Angela's purse, wallet, and license. However, the keys and money were gone. It quickly became apparent that somewhere along her journey that morning, Angela had encountered someone with dark intentions. Had it been a total stranger, someone passing through who'd abducted the 20-year-old, or did the answers perhaps lie closer to home? Was Angela the victim of a random crime, or had someone been stalking the young woman and planning an abduction all along? Perhaps even someone she may have known. This is Trace Evidence, episode 201, The Disappearance of Angela Gray Hamby. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious disappearance of Angela Hamby. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. 20-year-old Angela Hamby had her whole life in front of her. She was making plans for the future, working full-time while attending community college. Then, on a cool Friday afternoon, she took the day off to spend it shopping with her mother, but she mysteriously vanished before they could ever leave. This is episode 201, The Disappearance of Angela Gray Hamby. Night slowly descended upon the quaint town of Wilkesboro. Nestled along the south bank of the Yadkin River directly across from what's known as North Wilkesboro, it is the county seat of Wilkes County, located in northwestern North Carolina. It was the autumn of 1982, 2 days before Halloween, and all of Wilkesboro was in full swing for the holiday. Plastic skeletons swung slowly in the evening breeze. Toothy jack-o'-lanterns stared out from porch steps and living room windows, the flickering candlelight dancing inside freshly carved angular eyes. While for the vast majority of residents it was just another casual Friday night, ushering in the arrival of the holiday weekend, one family was in the midst of a desperate search for their daughter and sister. 20-year-old Angela Hamby had taken the day off to take her mother shopping, a fun adventure that never kicked off. Early that morning, Angela had left the family home to run some errands before a trip, but she'd never make it back. It was apparent that something was wrong early on. Angela wasn't the kind of daughter who just came and went as she pleased. She was reliable, dependable, the type who called home even if she were just going to be a few minutes late. As the hours began ticking by, it was obvious to her family that if she hadn't come home, then something terrible must have happened to her. By early evening, both Angela's family and the Wilkesboro Police were driving the main streets, back roads, and checking every secluded spot in between. Despite their efforts, they couldn't track down just where Angela might be, nor could they find anyone who had seen her throughout the day. Shortly after midnight, as the calendar flipped over to Saturday, excited chatter came across the police band. They'd located the missing woman's car, parked behind a local restaurant. Glenn's Tasty Freeze was a hotspot in town. The parking lot was constantly flooded with cars and people hanging out to grab a snack. Angela's car, a silver Mazda RX-7, was parked in the rear beside the dumpsters. Investigators approached the vehicle and found one of the doors unlocked. Inside, there was nothing that outright suggested a crime had taken place, but what they did find would confuse and baffle detectives and Angela's family for years to come. Her purse was there, having apparently been neatly placed on the floorboard of the passenger seat, the shoulder strap folded over top. Inside were all of Angela's personal belongings: makeup, wallet, driver's license. There seemed to be only two things missing: cash Angela had planned to deposit that morning, and her car keys. Investigators were immediately concerned. It wasn't like Angela to simply go off somewhere without telling anyone. Not to mention, she absolutely loved her car and would never have left it unlocked, nor would she have left her purse behind. What had originally begun as the search for a missing woman was now transforming into something vastly more complicated: the investigation of a likely abduction. As detectives raced against the clock to gather clues and evidence, they were keenly aware that each minute that passed put them even further behind in their search for Angela. Angela Gray Hamby was born on Sunday, January 21st, 1962, to parents Jerry and Shirley in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Angela was the Hamby's second child, with her older sister Cheryl having been born a few years earlier. Angela, or Angie as everyone called her, was described as a sweet, loving little girl who was excited for life, loved to laugh, and wasn't afraid to get dirty if it would lead to a good time. Angie grew up in a loving, close family with parents who believed in doing everything they could to improve their children's lives. Jerry and Shirley were very religious and raised their daughters through the local church, Pleasant Grove Baptist. Angie's sister Cheryl would later tell the Wilkesboro Record, quote, "Church was a huge part of our lives. Mom and Daddy took us there every time the door was open," end quote. Both she and Angie loved the church as much as their parents and were excited to go, whether it was on the normal Sunday schedule or for events throughout the week. They were always looking forward to it. Outside of church, the girls often spent time under the watchful eye of their maternal grandmother, Pearl, who lived on the same street and looked after them when their parents were working. Cheryl described their childhood as fun and exciting, explaining that she and Angie would climb trees, run through the woods, splash around in the creek, play softball, or just hang around the house putting on little shows with their Barbie dolls. Around the time Angie turned 6, her mother introduced the girls to music, and they quickly fell in love. While Cheryl was beginning piano lessons, Angie was right there. She explained, quote, "I'd play the piano and Angie would play the pump organ. We'd pretend we were at church and line our dolls up on the couch. They were in a very attentive audience," end quote. Eventually, Angie would take over on piano while Cheryl would be the singer, and they were quite good, performing at several weddings. Cheryl explained that Angie's favorite songs to play on the piano are "You Are So Beautiful" and "Bridge Over Troubled Water." Angie became an accomplished pianist and had a real passion for playing. This, of course, would bleed over into the girls' everyday lives as well, with them quickly developing a zest for bands like the Beatles and the Monkees. They memorized the songs and would sing them frequently. Angie and Cheryl were so close in appearance that oftentimes people would mistake them for twins. Despite all of the similarities they shared, as the two grew, their own unique personalities began to come through. Cheryl explained to the Record, saying, quote, "Angie was always the popular one. From the time she was in the 3rd grade, there would be boys bringing her candy on Valentine's Day. No one asked me out until I was 17. Angie always had boyfriends," end quote. Cheryl described herself as more quiet, studious, less involved in the social aspects of school. Angie was, for lack of a better term, an amalgamation of several different personalities. While some described her as shy and quiet, others would call her a cut-up who was always joking. A fiercely independent young woman who didn't allow people to push her around or tell her how to live her life. She was, in many ways, a walking contradiction. As many have said, she was a fiery woman, a pistol, so to speak. But even Cheryl described her as fragile-looking, delicate to the touch, saying she was somewhat bird-like in that she seemed to necessitate gentle care. Her cousin, Jill Oakley, explained that her personality would shift depending upon the situation, telling the Record, quote, "We'd always been buddies. At times, she was kind of quiet. She didn't have as big a mouth as I did. End quote. High school was, in a sense, the time when Angie began to explore her interests and sharpen her focus. She became a cheerleader, thrusting herself into one of the more popular circles at school. But despite this, Angie chose to hang out with a tight circle of friends, and while she knew a lot of people, few entered her inner circle. Noted as always being an attractive girl, the more Angie grew, the more beautiful she seemed to become, and the line of guys seeking her attention only grew longer and more diversified. She'd go on to become a member of concert choir, the Latin Club, the Office of Practice Staff, and the Spirit Club. According to the record in 1979, when Angie was a junior, she was a finalist for attendant to the Homecoming Queen. Janet Wood, a former classmate, thought highly of Angie and admired her. She was glad the two became such close friends. Wood described Angie as genuine, not the type to play games. She explained, quote, I remember I sang next to her in concert choir. She just had a real bubbly personality and a kind word for everyone. She never put a front up with anyone. She was always just Angie. End quote. According to her parents, Angie was in some ways a homebody. She went out and she dated, but she seemed most comfortable back at home where she spent most of her free time. She adored her dog, a Dachshund named Barney, and whenever she was around the house, he wasn't far behind. Cheryl, who graduated from West Wilkes High, began attending Appalachian State University in the town of Boone, some 30 miles to the west. Despite the distance, the sisters stayed in close contact, with Cheryl explaining that Angie called her 2, sometimes 3 times a day just to chat. They were always aware of what was going on in each other's lives, and as far as Cheryl knew, everything was going fairly well for her little sister. In the fall of 1979, Angie began her senior year and quickly was named captain of the varsity cheerleading squad. While this was obviously a big deal and Angie was super excited, there was something even more thrilling coming. Angie had been working part-time for the former Northwestern Bank and had been saving all of her money to make a down payment on a new car. In 1980, her dreams came to fruition when she purchased a silver Mazda RX-7. Angie absolutely adored the car and drove it every chance she had, even if she had nowhere to go. She'd just cruise around town enjoying the thrill of being behind the wheel of her own car, one she'd paid for herself. According to her family, Angie was so protective of the car she wouldn't let anyone else drive it. Not her mother, father, not even her sister. In the spring of 1980, Angie graduated from West Wilkes and enrolled in classes at Wilkes Community College. She didn't plan to stay at the school, instead thinking she'd eventually transfer to App State where she'd be closer to her sister. In the meantime, she continued to work for Northwestern Bank, where she was hired on full-time to work in their data processing department. It wasn't thrilling work, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it gave Angie pocket money and the ability to flex some of that independence. By the fall of 1982, Angie was 20 years old and excited about the future. Still working at the bank and driving her prized RX-7, she batted different ideas around. Family members later commented on how Angie had frequently mentioned her intention of becoming a flight attendant, though whether or not this was a possibility or something she truly wanted, no one can say for sure. Janet Wood figured Angie would end up at the head of her own company, telling the record, quote, I think she would have been working for herself. She was very independent. End quote. She had big ideas for the future, dreams she hoped to chase, but sadly, before she could ever wrap her hands around the brass ring, Angela Hamby would mysteriously vanish while running errands on a cool October morning. Angie and her mother Shirley had made plans together. They were going to take an out-of-town shopping trip to Elkin, 30 miles away, to hit a lot of stores and spend the day together. Both women took the day off, Friday, October 29th. Angie's father, Jerry, was out of town that weekend on a hunting trip in South Carolina. That Friday morning, both women were awake early and getting ready for their outing when Angie approached her mother and explained that she needed to run a few errands before they headed off. She had to fill her gas tank and drop off a car payment at the bank. Since her mother used the same bank, she'd also agreed to make a deposit for her. After the bank, she was going to head a few blocks north and drop by Burke's Jewelry, where Cheryl worked, to drop off a message for her older sister. All in all, the entire trip shouldn't have taken more than 30 minutes and would cover less than 20 miles. According to Shirley, as Angie left the house, she told her daughter to hurry up and get back so they could go out on their trip. What exactly occurred that day after Angie left her parents' Pads Road home has never been determined, but the 20-year-old never made it back. According to Shirley, her daughter drove away from the home at approximately 9:30 a.m. Expecting her to be back in 45 minutes to an hour at most, Shirley started growing concerned when 11 a.m. rolled around and there had been no word from Angie. This was out of character for her, as she always called if she was going to be late, especially when she knew her mother was waiting on her. An hour later, at 12 p.m., Shirley could no longer maintain her composure and began growing worried that something might be very wrong. She started making calls, trying to track down her daughter. She explained to the Record, quote, "By 12 o'clock, I was really upset. I just had a bad feeling. I called the bank, and they said she hadn't been there yet. Then I called Cheryl, and she hadn't seen her either. I knew something was wrong then." End quote. Once Shirley became aware that Angie had never made it to the bank or to her sister, she went out and started looking. Driving around Wilkesboro, she covered the main roads that Angie would have most likely taken. When she found no sign of her, she began hitting the back roads and lesser traveled throughways. But again, she found nothing to indicate where her daughter might be. While Shirley was worried, she couldn't yet imagine the scope of what had happened. She told the Record, quote, "I thought maybe she had met some of her friends and started talking. But for her to not come back when she was supposed to, that was totally out of character for her. She was always dependable. She would always call me and let me know." End quote. At approximately 4 p.m., 6 hours after Angie was last seen, Shirley placed two important phone calls. First, she rang the motel where Jerry was staying in South Carolina. He wasn't in at the time, so she left a message asking him to come home immediately. Next, she contacted the Wilkes County Sheriff's Department to report her daughter missing. Unsure of where she might be, Shirley ran through all of the places she'd planned to stop for her errands that morning. She gave investigators a full description of both Angie and the car, as well as a photo of the 20-year-old. At the time, the sheriff's department wasn't overly concerned. They figured she might have run into car trouble or perhaps had gotten sidetracked and lost track of time. All of the pertinent information was broadcast over the radio, and officers were advised to be on the lookout. The sheriff's department also reached out to both the Wilkesboro Police Department and the North Wilkesboro Police, who joined in on the search for the missing 20-year-old. As time continued to tick by, night slowly settled over Wilkesboro. Inch by inch, the shadows grew longer, flooding down one street and then the next. Shirley sat in growing fear and panic as streetlights slowly snapped to life, and one by one, houses along Pads Road clicked on their porch lights and settled in for the evening. It seems that this growing sense of dread was also felt by investigators at the sheriff's department, who next contacted the State Bureau of Investigation, the SBI, requesting their assistance in the search as they had yet to find a single trace of Angie. Time was an important factor, and each second that ticked by was another second further behind. While everyone was out trying to find Angie, Jerry Hamby returned to his hotel where he was notified at the front desk that he'd received an urgent message and to call home. Speaking to Shirley, she quickly informed her husband about Angie's disappearance, and moments later, Jerry was on the road back to Wilkesboro to try and find his daughter. His drive would take a few hours, and by the time he returned home, the growing sense of concern and worry was now an overwhelming wall of desperation and alarm. Meanwhile, just a few miles from the family home, one police officer was driving past Glenn's Tasty Freeze when he noticed a vehicle that closely matched the description of Angie's Mazda. Steve Cabe, a special agent with the SBI, was traveling across a bridge from the north end of town into Wilkesboro proper when his radio came alive. Former Wilkesboro Police Chief Delbert Wilson issued an urgent message. They had located Angie's car parked behind the Tasty Freeze near the dumpsters. According to Cabe, this announcement came across the radio at approximately 12:30 a.m., 15 hours after Angie had left the family home. Within the next 30 minutes, the parking lot of the Tasty Freeze was flooded with vehicles from all of the investigating agencies. In the rear, detectives were moving around the silver RX-7, examining the outside of the car via flashlight as the dark of night had swallowed up the restaurant parking lot. Angie's family were notified of the discovery and made their way down to the restaurant less than 4 miles from the family home. Cheryl distinctly remembers the feeling of unease that came over her when she arrived and saw the state of the car. While the driver's side door was reported to have been locked, the passenger door wasn't, and when police pulled it open, they spotted Angie's purse on the floor. Cheryl explained the details, telling the record, quote, "The strange thing about that is how the purse was placed. The strap was neatly folded around it. That's how she would have laid it there if she had been in the right frame of mind. If it had been a bad situation, I think she thought if she played her cards right, she'd be able to get out of it somehow." End quote. Going through the vehicle, detectives made note of several details they hoped would assist them in determining when the car had been parked there and what time Angie may have gone missing. Going through her pocketbook, detectives found that everything was present outside of 2 things: the money Angie had planned to deposit for her mother and the keys to her car. Everything else appeared to be there. The vehicle started without a problem, and the gas gauge confirmed that, at a minimum, Angie had made it to the gas station that morning, her first planned stop. According to the family, her car was almost out of gas when she'd left the house, but detectives found it with nearly a full tank. While finding the car had been a major break in the case, in all actuality, the vehicle had offered investigators few, if any, clues to assist them in tracking down Angie or determining what may have happened to her. There were no signs of a struggle in or around the car. There was no blood, no signs that anyone had rifled through it. It seemed almost as if Angie or someone else had parked the car there and just quietly walked away, though to where was another question altogether. Early on in the investigation, police believed foul play had to have been involved, but they hadn't found any evidence to support that theory. All they knew was no one who knew Angie believed she'd have just run off, nor would she have left her prized car behind. Asked his thoughts about the finding, Jerry Hamby was confused as investigators. The one detail that stood out to him was his daughter's purse lying on the floor. He explained to the Charlotte Observer, quote, "That would be the most peculiar thing because she never does that. I guess no woman does, leaving her car open with her handbag inside. It was totally out of character. Totally. If she left on her own, it was a total reversal of character." End quote. Ultimately, Angie's car was removed from its place at the restaurant and towed back to the Wilkesboro Police Department on Main Street. But Special Agent Cabe had other ideas. Picking up the phone, he rang the SBI district office in Hickory, 40 miles away, and requested that they send their mobile crime unit out to examine the car. An agent was dispatched with the vehicle and arrived in Wilkesboro later that Saturday afternoon. According to Cabe, not finding much inside or on the car to help them, they decided to do something that was new at the time. Angie's car would be transferred to the SBI crime lab in Raleigh, where they would sweep for fingerprints using a process known as superglue fuming. In this process, fumes from the glue adhere to moisture left behind by fingerprints. The fumes will adhere to the moisture, turning the ridges white, making it not only easier to collect fingerprints, but to locate them in general. In addition to this, the superglue fumes will also stabilize ridge details to better preserve the evidence for possible future enhancement at the lab. Of course, investigators would also need to obtain Angie's fingerprints in order to narrow down any unidentified prints they found. They requested items from the family, items that only Angie would have touched. They managed to get a few of Angie's prints, but according to Cabe, they never got the full set. Cabe would later tell the record, quote, "This was the first time this was done in North Carolina. We found evidence inside and outside of the car." End quote. What evidence was found has never been revealed, though given the superglue fuming tests, it seems generally accepted that investigators likely uncovered at least one unidentified print in the car, perhaps in an area which could add context to what had happened that Friday morning. Angie's family told investigators that, as far as they knew, the Tasty Freeze was not a place she often frequented. Frustrated by a lack of developments, no solid leads, nor real hard evidence, investigators next moved on to trying to track down where Angie had been the day she disappeared, who may have seen her, and most importantly, whether or not anyone had seen someone else with her. Different teams of investigators were assigned to different areas as they began gathering information. Some were sent to the school or church to question people who knew Angie and might have some insight into any people she could have been concerned about. Others interviewed the family to fill in the background and understand who Angie was, what she was into, what her behavior patterns were. Still yet, other teams went to Northwestern Bank to question coworkers, wanting to know if Angie had been upset in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Had she seemed worried about anything? Had she had trouble with anyone? Unfortunately, it seemed no one had much to add. They all spoke highly of Angie, but if she were in any trouble or concerned about anyone in particular, she'd never said anything about it. The two primary areas of interest for investigators were the gas station Angie stopped at that day, and of course the Tasty Freeze where her car was found. It was believed that Angie had likely stopped at what was then a Wilco gas station on US 421, a main road which cuts through town. The station was approximately 2 miles southeast of the family home. Investigators believe Angie likely left her home, heading north before turning south onto Winkler Mill Road. From there, she traveled a mile before turning south onto Dancy Road, which directly connects to 421. Turning east onto 421, Angie would have proceeded less than a mile until she reached the station. Arriving at the Wilco, investigators interviewed employees who had been working on the morning of the 29th. While several of them reported remembering the car, the silver Mazda RX-7 stood out. None of them could positively identify the driver as Angie. This stuck out as a little strange to detectives who felt that it was odd for a few guys working at the gas station to remember the car more than the 5 foot 4 inch, 105-pound beautiful woman behind the wheel. Either way, it seemed, they were fairly certain that Angie had been there that day, and if so, she must have encountered her abductors somewhere between there and her next stop, the bank, 5 miles away. Next, detectives arrived at Glenn's Tasty Freeze to question employees and patrons, hoping that someone might have seen something. At first, it appeared they had struck out, but when one employee returned to work on Monday, she had a story to tell. This witness, a female employee who worked in the kitchen, reported that sometime between 11:30 a.m. and 12 p.m., she had taken some garbage outside to empty into the dumpsters. At that time, she walked behind the store and clearly saw Angie's silver RX-7 parked in the spot investigators would later find it at. The witness told police that there were two people in the car, a man and a woman. The man was sitting in the driver's seat while the woman was in the passenger seat. The witness told investigators that she couldn't get a good look at the woman. It was midday and the sun was bearing down on the windshield, making that side of the car difficult to see. However, she did get a good look at the driver. Such a good look that the SBI called in sketch artists to create a composite of the unknown man. He was described as a white male with shoulder-length, dirty blonde hair and a short, scraggly beard. The witness stated that he had a thin face and appeared to be in his 20s. According to the witness, it appeared that Angie and this unknown man were either arguing or talking back and forth aggressively. Upon hearing this new tip, Cheryl went down to the Tasty Freeze and spoke to the employee herself. She relayed the conversation to the record, saying, quote, "The woman told me that it looked like they were arguing. I think she knew whoever it was. I think it was either an acquaintance or someone she had some sort of relationship with and didn't want anyone to know about." End quote. The witness's description was good enough for the composite to be created and shown to Angie's family in hopes that perhaps someone might recognize him. Sadly, no one did. None of Angie's friends, coworkers, or classmates seemed to know who the guy might be. As a result, when flyers were produced showing Angie and a description of her disappearance, the composite was added. Unfortunately, there weren't a ton of leads developed at that time. The mystery of who this man was at the heart of the case, but no one could identify him. Angie's family, for their part, believed that it was highly unlikely she'd have picked up a stranger by choice, given her shy nature around people she didn't know. As publicity for the case began ramping up, with newspapers and television media covering the disappearance, the calls coming into police increased dramatically. While much of it was static, leading only to dead ends and based purely on speculation, there were a few details discovered that investigators hoped would fill in gaps for the timeline. The first lead, which caught on, came from a woman who worked at a clothing store downtown, approximately 1.5 miles west of Northwestern Bank, Angie's planned second stop. In a discussion with the Record, Cheryl explained the details this caller delivered to police. After hearing her account, she went to the store herself, a local clothing store called J.E.'s, which she and her sister had frequented. Cheryl explained, quote, "She told me that Angie was standing near the front of the store, just flipping through clothes but not looking at them. She said she was looking out the window the whole time. It was like someone was following her and she was trying to avoid them. Whatever it was, though, she must not have been too scared." End quote. According to this witness, Angie had entered the store sometime around 10 a.m. While she had seen Angie enter and thought her behavior was out of character, she got caught up with work and didn't notice at what time the 20-year-old left. However, there was another witness who claimed to have seen Angie around the same time. In 1982, Gary Parsons was a sergeant with the Wilkesboro Police Department and later would go on to become chief of police. Parsons had finished working third shift and was making his way home when he claims to have encountered Angie on the road, close to the Winn-Dixie, which was within 2 miles of the clothing store the previous sighting had come from. Parsons would later tell the Record, quote, "I knew the family and I knew Angie good enough to tell who she was. There were 2 girls in town that were named Angie that drove the same kind of cars. I remember looking to see which Angie it was." End quote. According to Parsons, when he saw Angie, she was in the car alone, and there didn't appear to be anything out of the ordinary or concerning happening. If true, this would mean that either Angie hadn't yet encountered her abductor, or maybe he was in the car but hiding from view. Whether or not Parsons' account is reliable depends upon your perspective. He was later fired as the chief of police after being charged with several felonies and misdemeanors related to a dereliction of duty and misuse of town property. Some people feel that Parsons did see Angie that day and had no reason to lie about it. Others don't consider his credibility reliable enough to put anything of importance on it. By the end of the weekend, detectives had these new sightings of Angie but little else to work with. Their biggest challenge was an absolute absence of any real hard evidence to give them a direction to go. At that point, they were somewhat left in the hands of the community, hoping that someone would come forward with another sighting or some piece of information. While investigators were out trying to follow any leads they did have, the Hamby family was struggling. Throughout the day, they stayed home and waited by the phone, hoping for a call that Angie had been found. When day transitioned to night and the phone hadn't rung, Shirley and Jerry would go out themselves. They'd drive around searching back roads and remote areas where they thought an attacker might dump a victim. They would drive late into the night because, as Shirley told reporters, quote, "We didn't go to bed. We were afraid to sleep." End quote. Unfortunately, the case began growing cold rapidly, at least in terms of directions to go and leads to follow. Calls continued to come in, but they weren't offering anything helpful. Agent Cabe later stated that he thought many of the calls were from local folks who felt bad and wanted to offer up information even if it ultimately didn't help. That year, Halloween came and went with little fanfare for the Hamby family, who already felt like they were living a real-life horror story of their own. By mid-November, 2 weeks after Angie had last been seen, much of the hope that she would be found safe had begun to fade away. On Wednesday, November 17th, Governor Jim Hunt announced a $5,000 reward for information leading to arrests in what authorities were at the time classifying as a kidnapping. Angie's family also offered a reward, $10,000, bringing the total to $15,000. Wilkes County Sheriff Kyle Gentry stated that he had sought a reward offer from the governor because of the circumstances of her disappearance, which law enforcement agreed suggested abduction rather than leaving of her own volition. As for the Hamby family, they certainly weren't flush with cash, so when a reporter asked how they planned to pay that reward should it become necessary, Shirley replied, "From a loan. We don't have the money." Now, with reward money available, new missing persons posters were printed up, and both law enforcement and the Hamby family made quick work of spreading them all over town, then surrounding towns, then across the western half of the state. By the end of the month, there were flyers about Angie's disappearance as far away as California, as many truck drivers took extra copies to put up at their stops along the way. While this helped spread the word about the disappearance, it also resulted in investigators fielding calls from all over the United States from people who thought they'd seen Angie. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these calls were chalked up to being cases of mistaken identity, cruel pranks, or they went unverified as no one managed to track down the person who had been sighted. By December, less than a month after her disappearance, investigators were grasping at straws. None of their leads had panned out, and anyone they did look at with any suspicion had managed to provide them with an ironclad alibi for their whereabouts that morning. Sheriff Gentry vented his frustration, telling the Observer, quote, "It's really baffling. We sure wish something would turn up." End quote. It was no easier for the family, who felt powerless to help in any way. All they could do was search, but with each passing day, it seemed less likely they'd stumble upon anything that would lead them to Angie. Jerry later told the Observer, quote, "I really wish I knew something. I don't know what to think. Somehow or other, I think she's okay, but maybe that's because I want to think that." End quote. Soon, Christmas came and went, then New Year's. January 21st, 1983 marked what should have been a day for celebration, Angela's 21st birthday. Instead, the family marked the day with broken hearts and an outpouring of emotion. They were lost, unsure of what to do next, but keenly aware their lives were never going to be the same. Time continued to pass, and then in March, another tragedy struck when Angie's grandmother, Pearl, passed away. Pearl had been extremely close with Angie, and Shirley believes that her disappearance quickened her passing, the pain and stress weighing heavily on her heart. Time, as it always does, continued to move regardless of what others might wish. Soon, days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. Periodically, there would be new articles written about Angie and her disappearance. These would always result in a small but strong flood of new calls for investigators to sort through. In January of 1984, Shirley sat down for an interview with the Observer, and in the 15 months that had passed since Angie's disappearance, her disposition had taken a darker tint. Early on, Shirley believed her daughter was alive somewhere out there and would be found, but after so much time, it was impossible to ignore the more painful possibilities. Asked what she thought, Shirley replied, quote, "I don't feel like I did this time last year, when I believed she was alive and would come home. But I can't believe that she is dead either. Sometimes I wonder if she ever got out of the county, but it seems like if she had been murdered here, her body would have been found by now. Maybe it would be easier if I knew she was dead. If I knew she was dead, I'd have something to adjust to. Now, we are just on hold for a while. The whole thing is knowing there's nothing you can do but wait." End quote. While it seemed apparent that hope was in short supply, FBI Special Agent Steve Cabe wasn't ready to relinquish his goal of solving this case and bringing answers to the family. While more than a year had passed, he remained positive, telling the Observer, quote, "Every agency in this area worked on that case in the beginning. It is still a very active investigation." End quote. Cabe stated that they had used every resource available to them, but had mostly come up empty-handed. He did, however, make the curious statement that while they had gathered some physical evidence, it had never amounted to enough to make an arrest. Did this mean they had someone, or perhaps more than one person, they were looking at as possibly being involved? Cabe replied that he couldn't answer that question at the time. Once again, time continued on. It seemed like every few years, investigators would find the case growing hot again. They'd get new leads, track down possible persons of interest, and almost every time, they'd run into an impossible to impeach alibi or someone who wasn't even in the area at the time the crime occurred. In April of 1987, more than 4 years after the disappearance, then Chief of Police Gary Parsons announced that they were investigating two men, Michael Torrance and his brother Thomas, along with Thomas's wife Donna Webb, had been arrested in South Carolina and charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of armed robbery in connection with the killings of Charles Bush and his co-worker Dennis Lawless. While the arrests were splashed all over the newspapers, no one in Wilkesboro considered a possible connection until they received a call from investigators in Lexington, where the arrests had been made. Apparently, while going through the homes of one of the men, they'd come across a family photo album. Tucked into that album was a cutout newspaper clipping about Angie's disappearance. This was enough for investigators to travel south to question the three about their potential involvement in the abduction and likely murder of Angela. Unfortunately, Chief Parsons would later announce that records indicated the men had been in jail at the time the crime occurred. Asked his feelings following this development and then its dismissal, Jerry Hamby was unsure exactly of how to feel, telling the Observer, quote, "I guess I was relieved. Apparently those guys are sort of rough customers. But I get to the point where I just like to know something, even if it was bad." End quote. Sadly, following the investigators' ruling out of the Torrance brothers, it was back to square one with little to show for how many years had passed. By this point in time, Angie's case wasn't being pursued every day, but instead, investigators would focus on it when they had time, between other, newer crimes. Any tips called in were followed up on, but they never went anywhere. There was the couple who claimed to have seen Angie using a payphone in Florida. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. There was the caller who was certain he'd seen Angie down in Louisiana, but when followed up on, it was a different person altogether. One couple called in so passionately certain that they'd seen Angie at a Fort Worth area truck stop that Sheriff Gentry went down to Texas himself to follow up. He managed to locate the couple and the young woman they'd seen. Steve Cabe explained that it was another dead end, saying, quote, "He sat down and talked to that woman. It wasn't Angie. Every lead we had was a dead end. I've never had a case where there wasn't some type of lead that turned out to be something." End quote. As it turned out, it wasn't just random strangers who believed they were seeing Angie everywhere, but even her own family. Jerry told the Observer how on several occasions he thought he'd seen his daughter, explaining, quote, "I have a number of times myself seen someone on the street in a town somewhere away from here, and I've met people on the highway that I think look like her. I find myself checking out everyone." End quote. By 2001, nearly 20 years had passed since Angie vanished, and investigators didn't appear to be any closer to finding the answers. A lot had changed during that time. Detectives who had worked the case moved on, changed departments, retired. Special Agent Cabe left the SBI, taking a job as a captain of the Wilkes County Sheriff's Department. He had been there that first night when Angie's car was found, and nearly 2 decades later, he was still involved with pursuing her case. In April of that year, Cabe announced to the Record that, for the first time in a long time, they had some new possibilities. After local newspapers published stories about Angie's case with the 20th anniversary approaching, new calls started coming in. This would ultimately lead Cabe to state that they had as many as 6 potential persons of interest who they were trying to narrow down. While he wouldn't reveal the names, Cabe did state that 3 of the 6 had criminal records, one for assault, another for breaking and entering, and another for larceny. At that time, Cabe explained, the SBI was working to try and eliminate some of the men or to find evidence securing a link between them and Angie's disappearance. Most of the tips they'd gotten had been from locals calling in, though Cabe was hopeful that they'd eventually get what they needed, saying, quote, "We're of the opinion that it never hurts to get information. That's how we operate. You never know. It could create a lead that could be fruitful. We check the obvious first. That can make or break your lead right away. These are difficult leads to check, but it can and will be done." End quote. Sadly, as quickly as these leads developed, it appears they disappeared as well. While I couldn't find any official word from investigators saying that all 6 men had been cleared, I couldn't find any discussion of them after 2001 either. 4 years later, in 2005, Wilkesboro Detective Tommy Rhodes officially took over the case from Chief Gary Parsons. He had to work it as a cold case, fitting in time between active investigations. As he told the Record, quote, "Basically what I'm doing, as time permits me, I just clean off my desk and start reading. I'm trying to pick up on different points and learn about everything that's already been chased down. It's a very large file, but it's a case we would very much like to find closure to." End quote. For Rhodes, he didn't think he was going to find much answers in the case files, and apparently he didn't. To him, he thought the answers were somewhere in the community, that someone who had lived in the area in 1982 and maybe was still living there knew more than they had ever shared. He explained, quote, "I think it will take someone coming forth that knows something. I can't foresee finding anything in the file the other investigators didn't already find. Still, the ultimate goal is to solve this case. I really feel that somebody out there knows something and they're just hanging on to the information." End quote. Shirley was of a similar belief, thinking that the answers had always been close to home. She told the Record, quote, "Whatever happened to her happened in this town. Someone in this town knows what happened." End quote. 1 year later, in 2006, Steve Cabe sat down with the Record to discuss the case, where it was at, and what he thought might have happened. He explained, quote, "There is no doubt in my mind that she was abducted, but the question will always be, did she go willingly at first? She could have gone willingly, and then things just turned bad." End quote. Cabe believed there were likely at least two and possible as many as three people involved in Angie's abduction. He explained, quote, "Based on what we know, there must be a third person. How else did they leave Glenn's? Even if they called a cab, there was a third party involved. They weren't there at 12:30 the next morning when we found the car. They had to leave by some method." End quote. This was a sticking point, one that continued to come up whenever the case was looked at closely. Why, of all places, would the abductors have taken Angie to the Tasty Freeze, a popular spot where there were potentially dozens of patrons and employees who could have seen what was going on? For Cheryl, it never made any sense as she told the Observer, quote, "That place is always busy. All she would have to have done was scream." End quote. In hopes of finding something, anything, Cabe explained that he had previously spent time speaking with members of the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit, which was in the midst of interviewing serial killers in hopes of understanding them and learning how to catch them. One of the methods they had developed revolved around creating a profile of the suspect, one which might offer insight into his appearance, habits, psychology, and drive. Unfortunately, in Angie's case, it simply wasn't an option, with Cabe telling the Record, quote, "That's mainly done when you have a body to work with. You have to look at what is done to a body by one of these criminals in order to establish a profile. Here, we don't have a body. We only have a set of circumstances. Everything here just goes in a circle." End quote. Indeed, it seemed the investigation into Angie's abduction was a long, endless circle, which always sent investigators and her family back to the beginning, to the heart of the case. The known details, the timeline, the circumstances, the locations. Nothing made sense, nothing connected. It was as if Angie had encountered a ghost that Friday morning, because as far as detectives were concerned, they never had much on the guy, let alone a name to pursue to the bone. The last major media coverage came in 2007, 25 years after Angie's disappearance. There, the Record once again spoke to Steve Cabe, who maintained his belief that eventually they would close the case. It was just a matter of time and finding a key piece of evidence or information that could finally unlock the entire confusing mystery. Unfortunately, they just couldn't track it down. Cabe explained, quote, "I would love to have one absolute positive lead, but we, to my knowledge, have never had a specific lead that we were able to keep going for any length of time." End quote. Since 2007, there has been almost nothing. Angie's father, Jerry, sadly passed away in 2019 at the age of 81. He spent nearly the last half of his life, 37 years, searching for his daughter and hoping that someday he would find her or the person responsible. In an interview conducted later in his life, Jerry explained that he didn't want to pass away before he knew the truth, saying, quote, "I just want to know what happened. Good or bad, I want to know, although I can't imagine how it could be good." End quote. Unfortunately, the answers still haven't been found, though Angie's family believe that Jerry has been reunited with his beloved daughter and await the rest of the family in heaven. It's been difficult for the family over all of these years, as no matter how many birthdays, Thanksgivings, and Christmases go by, it's never any easier to go on without knowing. Cheryl explained to the record, saying, quote, "I've spent half my life without her now, and that seems odd. I'd have bad dreams. I'd dream all night that I was searching. Sometimes I'd dream that I found her, but when I woke up and she wasn't there, I'd fall to pieces. I had a gut feeling that she was dead, but I didn't want to believe it. If she was living or breathing, I know she would have called or something." End quote. Shirley added in that at the time, she and Angie were just breaking new ground on their relationship. As daughter became an adult, Shirley was excited to share more of their lives together. She explained, quote, "Angie had just gotten old enough to where she was a good friend, and then we lost her. But there's no good time to lose a child." End quote. When last seen, Angela Gray Hamby was described as being a white female with blonde hair and blue-green eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 105 pounds. She was last seen wearing a cream-colored V-neck sweater under an orchid-colored sweater, blue jeans, and socks with sandals. She was also wearing a gold Ada bead necklace and a diamond and sapphire ring she'd recently purchased from Burke's Jewelry, where her sister worked. Her silver 1980 Mazda RX-7 was discovered abandoned at Glenn's Tasty Freeze, approximately 3 miles from her Pads Road home. The vehicle, after being properly searched, was kept in the family driveway until Jerry's passing in 2019. Her family simply couldn't bear to part with it. According to witness accounts, Angie was seen at the former Wilco gas station on US 421 sometime between 9:30 and 10 a.m. She may have also been seen at J.E.'s, a local store, and driving near the Winn-Dixie between 10 and 10:30. The final sighting occurred between 11:30 a.m. and 12 p.m. at the Tasty Freeze, where a cook saw Angie in the passenger seat of her car with an unknown man driving. He was described as a white male with shoulder-length, dirty blonde hair and a short, scraggly beard. The witness stated that he had a thin face and appeared to be in his 20s. A composite sketch of that suspect is available. Angela Hamby has been missing since 12 p.m. on Friday, October 29th, 1982. She was 20 years old at the time, and if alive today, would now be 60. There is no easy answer for the disappearance of a loved one. Angie's family has tried for decades to try and find those answers, to bring their beloved daughter and sister home, even if only to lay her to rest. The hole created by her absence could never be filled, and while life continues on, there is not a single day that her loved ones don't think of her, miss her, wish to speak to her, and hug her. No one knows what Angie might have done with her life, what career she'd have chosen, whether or not she'd have married and had a family. All they know is what they've lost since the day she vanished, and as it's been etched into their brains for nearly 40 years. The pain never stops, and the questions are never answered. Asked about the loss of her sister so many years later, Cheryl replied, quote, "I wish Angie could have met my girls. I know she would have spoiled them. In a way, that's the saddest thing of all." The disappearance of Angela Gray Hamby is one of those cases where the utter lack of evidence is only compounded by the pain and grief of unknowing. A smart, level headed 20-year-old woman leaves her home to run a few errands and never makes it back. 15 hours later, her prized car is found abandoned less than 5 miles from her house. Backtracking her plans for that day, police find that she only made it to the first stop on her list. Somewhere between the gas station on US 421 and Northwestern Bank, something went terribly wrong. One of the questions, which has lingered for nearly 4 decades, is, did Angie know the man in the car with her that day, or had he forced his way in and taken over? No one knows for certain. While none of Angie's friends or family members seemed able to identify the man in the sketch, others have theorized that perhaps Angie had a side of her life that no one knew about. Even her sister Cheryl thinks there's a chance Angie knew the man but had kept him away from friends and family for reasons unknown. Perhaps it was someone she was friends with. Maybe it was someone who she had dated or who had wanted to date her. Given how many people commented about Angie's looks, about the line of guys chasing her around, it isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility that this guy could have been a suitor who, after being rejected, began making plans of his own. So if we start at the beginning, there's a few things that have never fully lined up. Firstly, if indeed Angie was planning to get gas, make a car payment, and stop by to talk to her sister, why was it necessary for her to do this alone? Surely it would have been just as simple to run these errands with Shirley and then head out of town together without needing to stop back at the house. Maybe Angie was just being polite, not wanting to drag her mom around town for errands. Surely a possibility. Others, however, think that maybe Angie had to make an unscheduled stop, or at least one she didn't tell her mother about. Could this have involved the unidentified man, or did he truly come out of nowhere? We don't have a lot to work with outside of sightings of her that day. If we break them down, we know she made it to the gas station, but what happened after is unknown. We have the woman at the clothing store who knew Angie and said she saw her that morning around 10. According to her, Angie looked like she'd come in the store to avoid someone, like she was hiding out and paying more attention to what was going on in the parking lot rather than the clothing rack she quickly thumbed through. It sounds like Angie would have been frightened of someone, but Cheryl points out she couldn't have been that scared. She didn't ask to use the phone to call her mother or sister. She didn't say she was worried. She didn't seek out help from the employee who she knew. Instead, at some point, she walked back out of the store and into a seemingly endless mystery. The next sighting, which takes place within minutes of this one, comes from former police chief Gary Parsons. Now, while Parsons was eventually fired for misappropriating town property and a dereliction of duty, I don't know that this makes his sighting that day any less viable. It's not as if he'd had something to gain from making up the sighting, and being that he knew Angie's family, it would be even more wild to imagine that he'd have fabricated this encounter. According to Parsons, he was driving by a Winn-Dixie within a mile or so of the bank Angie would have been headed towards. Parsons tells investigators that he recognized the car and looked to see who it was, and at the time he clearly recognized Angie. If accurate, this is the last sighting of Angela before the Tasty Freeze, and this puts her in her car alone and seemingly without issue. Now, some folks have gone on to speculate that perhaps the reason this crime was never solved was because maybe a member of law enforcement was involved. Certainly, cops aren't above suspicion in any case, but there's one problem here, one issue which never seems to get addressed by those who buy into the possibility. If this were a cop, especially if he were local, how the hell would no one have recognized him? Outside of being undercover, how many police officers are allowed to wear their hair to the shoulder, keep scraggly beards, and are foolish enough to take an abduction victim to one of the busiest restaurants in town at lunchtime? I'm certainly not ruling out the possibility, but there doesn't seem to be a lot to support it. I'd imagine if Gary Parsons had resembled the description of the unknown man, then maybe we'd have something to work with. The next sighting comes from a cook working at the Tasty Freeze. According to her statement, she sees the silver Mazda RX-7 parked behind the restaurant near the dumpsters. While she can't see inside the car too clearly, the sun is obstructing her view, she tells police she saw an unknown man in the driver's seat and a woman in the passenger. While initially it was reported that she told police the man and woman were talking, she later clarifies that it seemed more like they were arguing. There's a couple of problems with this account, at least in terms of what investigators have to work with. Firstly, why was this guy driving Angie's car? It was her prized possession, one she didn't even let family members drive. So even if she did know the guy, it's highly unlikely she'd have willingly handed over her keys. Then we have to think about what the witness said. I haven't ever seen anything stating that she 100% confirmed the woman she saw in that car was in fact Angie, which raises a question. Is it possible that this woman was someone else? Perhaps someone who had been involved in abducting Angie that day and then was with the assailant afterwards to dispose of the car. Until I see something concrete that tells me the witness identified the woman as Angie, no doubt, I think we have to keep that in the back of our mind. What makes more sense? That this person abducted Angie and then drove her to one of the busiest places in town at lunchtime, or that this man and possibly the woman were involved in the crime and were arguing about their intentions to abandon the car, or maybe what they had done to Angie. A lot of people have theorized that this may have been a robbery gone wrong. Angie had a decent amount of cash on her that afternoon, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that someone could have seen it and wanted to get their hands on it. Maybe she pulled the cash out to pay for the gas. Maybe they just saw the car and her jewelry and assumed she must have had money. Maybe it was so completely random that they didn't know whether she had anything of value or not, but she had a nice car, so it was worth a shot. Given Angie's shy nature and everyone who knew her arguing that she'd never pick up a total stranger like the one described by the witness, it leaves us with few options. Either Angie did know someone who looked like that and let him drive the car, or this person forced their way in, likely armed, and took control. Now, if you were to say a woman had manipulated Angie in some way, perhaps requesting help or just chatting her up while her boyfriend or co-conspirator got into position to strike, that might be a little easier to swallow. At the same time, there's always this belief that if there's no sign of a struggle, then the victim may have gone along willingly, at least in the beginning. While that's possible, it's always frustrating to think about weapons. How much of a struggle are you going to find if this guy pulled out a gun or a knife and held it to Angie, telling her to go along quietly or there'd be trouble? There are so many possibilities, it's just too difficult to determine. Perhaps one of the more pertinent questions to ask is not what happened before the car arrived at the Tasty Freeze, but what occurred after. Assuming it was indeed Angie in the car, where did they go from there? There were dozens of people at the restaurant, but apparently no one outside of the cook saw anything. That seems strange. This was a noticeable car. People checked it out when it went by. Hell, the guys at the gas station remembered it, but no one at the restaurant did. That's always seemed odd. But indeed, if they had come in and parked behind the building near the dumpsters, maybe they did go unnoticed. Regardless, I return to the same question that's always haunted this case. Why go there at all? It doesn't make sense to abduct someone and in the middle of it to drag them to a busy place where there's a chance of being seen, where Angie could scream and draw a crowd of attention at a moment's notice. The only reason to go there would be either that's where the abductor had a vehicle waiting, or maybe they knew someone who worked there that might help them out. The only other reason I can imagine is that it's a busy spot and perhaps they believe the car would get lost in the shuffle. In actuality, that's pretty much what happened. Against all odds, no one sees or hears anything out of the ordinary at the Tasty Freeze that afternoon. At least, no one outside of the cook. So you have to assume that Angie's been abducted. More than likely, this isn't going to end well. It isn't often that abductors set their victims free and disappear, never to be heard from again. If Angie had been killed somewhere around Wilkesboro and then dumped, I tend to agree with her mother that her body or some trace of her would have eventually been found. This opens up the possibility that Angie may have been taken out of town, perhaps north to Virginia. It's an hour drive. The same goes for Tennessee, an hour to the west. South Carolina isn't a lot further, an hour and a half. Remember, the car is found 12 hours after the Tasty Freeze witness sees it, and in 12 hours, they could have gone almost anywhere. 12 hours is enough time to get as far away as Miami, Missouri, or even New England. There are a lot of rural spots in North Carolina, both around and far from Wilkesboro, where someone could have disposed of Angie's body. Between national parks, rivers, lakes, mountainsides, and caverns, someone who was familiar with the area could have selected a location where no one was ever going to find anything. It's a sad reality, but the world is a big place, and there are a lot of undiscovered dark spots where almost anything or anyone can be concealed for hundreds of years without anyone being the wiser. While investigators and Angie's family held out hope that she would be found, after all this time, the general consensus agrees. Angie is likely deceased, and considering statistics, was likely killed within 24 to 48 hours of her abduction. Sadly, we don't really have any suspects to discuss. Different names have been tossed around from time to time. Guys Angie had dated, guys Angie had worked with, guys Angie had gone to school with. The thing is, police have never mentioned any of those names. On online forums, Facebook, and elsewhere on social media, a lot of folks point their fingers at almost any guy who ever knew Angie. Certainly, the possibility exists that this was personal, that it was someone she knew, someone who either tricked her into being captured that day or who had planned to abduct her and kill her for weeks, even months before it actually happened. There's also the chance that whatever happened to Angie that day was completely random. Someone sees she's got cash, or someone wants her car, or maybe they want her. She stops at a light, she walks out of a store, and before she knows it, someone is pushing her into the car with a knife in their hand or a gun. They take the keys and drive off, planning to rob her, and perhaps something far worse. On the one hand, it's easy to believe it had to be this way. Angie was popular, smart, attractive, hardworking. She grew up in Wilkesboro. She knew everyone. It's just not possible that someone from that town could have done something so terrible. On the other hand, we know monsters don't just live in the big cities. They come in all shapes and sizes from all around the world. It's certainly plausible that one of them was from Wilkesboro. So where does that leave us? Not with a whole lot. It isn't difficult to see why this case has remained unsolved for so long. Investigators have never managed to find much more than a few sightings, a composite drawing, and a car which yielded little to no evidence. Investigators and Angie's family tend to believe that the answers lie somewhere in Wilkesboro, that the man who abducted Angie that afternoon was local, knew the area, and possibly even knew Angie's travel patterns and plans. If indeed that is the case, then there's likely more than one person who knows the truth. Criminals talk, they brag, they tell their friends about the things they've done. They try to one-up and impress one another. To pretend that no one out there knows what happened to Angie is simply asinine. What do you think happened here? Did Angie have a secret part of her life, one in which this unidentified man was involved? Did she know she was seeing him that day? Was she frightened of him? Or did she believe she needed to be? Or was this random? Someone passing through, a criminal moving from town to town, robbing and murdering lone women as they come across them? Surely someone out there knows the truth, and without them coming forward, new evidence being discovered, or the abductor confessing, the disappearance of Angela Gray Hamby will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Angela Gray Hamby, there are many online forums and news articles discussing her case. Both the Charlotte Observer and Wilkesboro Record were the most helpful in putting this episode together. If you have any information about the disappearance of Angela Gray Hamby, please contact the Wilkesboro Police Department at 336-667-7277. Her case number is 210042. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our very amazing Patreon producers. Thank you to Alicia Townsend, Amy Guthrie, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Brittany Bivens, Christine Greco, Denise Dingsdale, Donna Buttram, Diane Dyson, Eamon Brady, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Greg, Guillerme Pinto, Haley Christie, James, Jennifer Winkler, Jill Sense, Joni Berkowitz, Julie Mangano, Kara Moreland, Lars Jensen Fengel, Leslie B., Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Quinn McBreen, Sarah Lyons, Susie the Cutie, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, Tom Archer, and Tom Radford. Thank you so much for your amazing support. Without you, this show would not be possible. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This wraps up our look into the mysterious 1982 disappearance of 20-year-old Angela Gray Hamby, a case that will hopefully be solved sooner than later. I want to thank all of you for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.